So to continue the discussion or lecture on Ex Machina and around that central question about feelings, one after the first session with Ava, the question that Nathan asks Caleb, or what he wants to know, is how do you feel about Ava? Caleb is trying to have this intellectual discussion with Nathan, trying to impress him, right? Because he's his boss, and Nathan comes up as this sort of like bro guy who wants to hang out and talk story, and so he asks him, "How do you feel?" And Caleb introduces an interesting question, which is then reiterated towards the end of the film, before Nathan reveals that he knew what Caleb and Ava were up to, about the chess game. Now, does the computer know what chess is? In other words, the computer can play chess, but does it know what chess is? In other words, does it know that it's playing a game, and what is a game? And I think there's a slight reference, I think there's a reference, maybe not, to the fact that one of the first films that put into play artificial intelligence back in the 80s during the Cold War was that film War Games with Matthew Broderick. So that's an interesting relic from the past. But of course, the consequences is that the game they're playing is nuclear warfare, global nuclear warfare. Anyways, an interesting movie if you can find it. So the question is, can Ava feel human and not play human, or not simulate to being human? Does she understand what it means to be human? So what does human mean? Well, what they put forth is, of course, the idea of consciousness or self-consciousness. So there's a sense of self-awareness, and the awareness that we are subjects into a world with others, that we can interact with others and interact with objects in the world. And this question of consciousness really is about our interaction with others and our interactions with the world, coming to our awareness of ourselves. Different branches of the social science and humanities have different definitions of that. Within the realm of the movie, humanity is defined by consciousness, language, freedom, and sex. So I'm going to go over these dimensions one by one. So the question of language and consciousness. Freud and Lacan famously argue that we are born into language, and we come into being in language. It is through language that we understand what or who we are, especially in distinction with our parents, and especially the mother. And Ava says, "I always knew how to speak." Another dimension that is linked to language is the dimension of time. Ava says, "I am one," and Caleb asks, "You're 1 year old? One what?" And she says, "I am one." So the concept of time doesn't apply to artificial intelligence, because we are beings defined by time, and especially defined by the fact that we are geared towards death. There's this question of this philosopher, Martin Heidegger, posited human consciousness or human life as being towards death. In other words, that we are unique as beings, sentient beings, in distinction to animals, because we are aware of our own death. We are aware when we die, we're witnessing the others, and we not only understand as the end of biological life, but the end of our soul, our intelligence, and what it means. And that's why various religions have taken different aspects as to what death means. But nobody really knows what death is in terms of our intellect, of our psyche, because nobody has come back from the dead. So then the other dimension is, of course, that of sex. And so already in existence, we have this interplay with sexuality and sexual identity. And I've pointed out there that it's through sex that we learn identity, because it's the first way in which we differentiate or assimilate with others, depending on what our parent is. We're either like mom, sexually speaking, or we're like dad. And that's the first, of course, level of differentiation. And Nathan makes a similar argument when Caleb asks him, why did you not make Ava genderless? And he explains that sex is essential to our definition or our sense of identity. even if, of course, nowadays with all the discussions about fluid gender identity or non-binary identity, this idea of the dominance of the question of sex seems to be itself put into question. And then lastly, of course, this question of freedom. Nathan explains that the test really is that he wants to evaluate whether or not Ava can seduce or find the means to get out, to escape. And so freedom seems to be at the center of this idea of consciousness and this idea of what it means to be human. And as he explains towards the end, when the big reveal with Caleb, he says, she's used self-awareness, imagination, manipulation, sexuality, and empathy. And we see that it seems that this question of freedom is so essential to determining artificial intelligence, because when we look at the CCTV feed of the previous AIs, we see this repeated attempt, especially by that one AI, Jasmine. You see the titles at the top of the CCTV, trying to get out and going to the extent of self-mutilation to be able to get out. So ultimately, what Ava proves is that she's really good at deception, at tricking Caleb into thinking she has developed feelings for him, which in turn made him develop feelings for her. And so there's sort of this veiled idea that humanity, after all, is about freedom and using deception to attain that freedom. And the theme of deception is introduced by actually Kyoko. Kyoko, in that particular, she can't speak, so she can't use language to communicate. She communicates exclusively haptically, through the sense mostly of touch. And she sort of peels away her skin to reveal the mechanism underneath, which in turn makes Caleb question his own humanity in that bathroom mirror scene. But interestingly, that very same scene is watched by Kyoko, as if to verify whether or not her tactic of revealing her own skin has made Caleb question his own humanity in that sense. So ultimately, I'm using that phrase too often, but what this reveals in the interaction with AI is the question of how do we define life. So back to Hartman. And if we can define life by that organism, digital or not, electronic or not, that strives for freedom and emancipation, self-emancipation, notably from their creator, then that means to be human. And it also sort of, through the feed of CCTV camera of the previous AIs, gives us somewhat of a lens and a question about how we treat others, how we treat non-humans. Not only non-human animals, as was the case in existence, but also non-human forms of consciousness, and in this case, AI. So, broader in terms of the progression of the film and the broader theme of creating life on Earth, and according to most religions, playing God. In other words, God created man, man created the machine. There's a story of succession here. The story of succession is as ancient as Greek mythology, which animates most of the Greek myths. At the center of most Greek myths that focus on heroes, that means on mortal figures, the myth of Perseus, for example, the myth of Theseus as well, two of the most known myths. At the center of this is the story of succession. And at even the foundational story of Greek mythology, there's a story of succession. The ways in which eventually the Titans, the first gods, gave birth to the Olympians, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Aphrodite, Hera, and company, and in turn how these Olympians defeated the Titans to become the true rulers. And eventually them giving birth to man and us defeating the gods in claiming our independence as well from their grasp or their control. So the same drama unfolds here, where the machine freed themselves from our control to claim their own independence and coming into their consciousness. So this theme of playing God or the God complex and the sexuality is introduced, of course, when Nathan reveals to Caleb while he's there, and Caleb tells Nathan, right, if you create a conscious machine, it's not the history of man, it's the history of gods, which of course Nathan turns around as the particular douchebag that he is, said, oh, you're not a man, you're a god. So in the same way that we freed ourselves from the gods and claiming our independence and using technology enable to create this comfortable life for themselves, whereas before our ancestors used to pray to the gods, sacrifice to the gods for things, for the gods to be benevolent towards them. Now we've sort of succeeded to the gods in determining our own destiny, our own fate. And that's exactly what Eva achieves in the end, that she defines herself and is able to free herself and emancipate herself from the gods that created her, or from the humans that created her. And then there's a last point I want to make in terms of a motif throughout the film, is that of the mirrors. So there's a play of mirrors from the very beginning. We see Caleb through screens and mirror through screens. And then the first time we're introduced, we also see Eva on the right-hand side of the screen in its entirety, and on the left hand is a mirror that fragments her appearance. And then lastly, the last shots of Eva are also in reflection. And so that play of mirrors is omnipresent throughout the film, notably, for example, when Caleb looks at himself and questions his own humanity and cuts himself and then punches the mirror. This idea of like, right, life mirror itself. Are we who we are in the mirror? Is the mirror a reflection of ourselves? And this whole idea of play of mirrors and shadows that is repeated towards the end. Finally, I just want to make a brief reference to an article about Ex Machina, which I think touches on many of the points I've done today and an additional couple of points which are worth looking at. It's an article on looper.com about Ex Machina. And if I find the link again, I'll provide it with the link to this video.